Greetings and salutations, everyone, and welcome to another installment of An Old Testament Academic Reacts. In this episode, we're going to react to Joshua Woodard, or the Geologian as he's also known, and his video, Evidence for the Biblical Exodus. So if you guys like this sort of content, please hit that like button, and make sure you guys are subscribed in order to receive future notifications on any upcoming videos. And as always, let me know your thoughts in the comments section below. Additionally, I will also leave a link to his channel in the description below. So, without further ado, let's go ahead and dive right into this.
Slightly out of Genesis, we're going to talk about the end of Genesis with Joseph, but we're moving into the Exodus and talking about Egypt. So, similarly to what we talked about with Genesis and evolution, a lot of people are told there's no evidence for this. That's the common thread when we talk about the Bible in scholarly circles. Well, that didn't happen. I don't see evidence for that, so I shouldn't believe in that. And so again, the goal is to better understand the evidence so we can be better equipped to defend it and strengthen our faith with this. And we don't need this evidence. We know God's word is true, but I think it kind of boosts us. It gives us a good defense for it. So in Exodus 1, we are
before he reads the text here, I should like to mention that I really don't like this separation of camps between the Christian and unbeliever, or even between the Christian and Christian as far as claiming your camp as the biblical Exodus. I don't mind the separation of camps because that's exactly what it is, you know, the late date Exodus people and the early date Exodus people. But I think it's rather disingenuous and unfair to label one camp the biblical Exodus whilst the other camp is in the unbiblical Exodus. I just think that is very problematic and condescending.
told that Joseph dies in verse 6. All his brothers and all that generation, they die. And the sons of Israel are fruitful, and they increase, and they multiply, and the land is filled with them. However, a new king arises over Egypt, and he doesn't know Joseph and what his family has done for Egypt. And instead, he enslaves the Israelites. They're too numerous. He's afraid that they will gang up on them with their enemies and force them out of Egypt. So they force them to build two cities, and they're named Pithom and Ramesses. And so this word, Ramesses, is often used as the hallmark of where to look for evidence of the biblical Exodus, if it happened at all. And so
Again, he's using biblical Exodus. He should just say Exodus. We just have several views on the Exodus. That doesn't make one more biblical or the other one less biblical. It just means that we think we have evidence for an Exodus. So, and he's absolutely correct. This is one of our hallmarks or linchpins for late date Exodus. Is we've got Ramesses, we've got Pi Ramesses or P Ramesses in Exodus 1:11, which simply means house of Ramesses, and Pithom, which simply means house of Atum, which is an Egyptian god. Now, because we have textual evidence of P Ramesses, and we have archaeological evidence of P Ramesses, these two must be linked, right? Seems likely. So that's why we sort of push it to a late date Exodus, at least most of us do, within the reign of Ramesses II, whose dates there, 1279 and 1213, are on the screen.
a lot of archaeologists and scholars will look around that time, and so they look at Ramesses and the city there. It's called Pi Ramesses or P Ramesses, and it is created or constructed around the time of Ramesses the Great. So they look at Ramesses the Great.
More precisely, Ramesses the Great constructed, or he built, that city. Later, he would move the capital from Thebes in Upper Egypt, 600 kilometers south, to P Ramesses in the north, sometime during his reign.
And I have the date up there between 1279 and 1213 BC. And Ramesses the Great was one of the largest, was one of the greatest pharaohs of the time. So his empire was quite large, and he is very, very strong politically, militarily. And so when they look at this time, they don't see any evidence of slaves. They don't see any archaeological evidence of plagues that destroyed the land. Egypt is not destabilized. You'd think if that happened, Egypt would be ravaged. There should be evidence of it. And so when they look back at that time, all they find is Ramesses, this great palace and store city. There's no evidence of Israelites. So
I'm going to stop him here because what sort of evidence were you seeking? Were you seeking nationwide evidence of any plague? I understand that when the first plague, when the Nile running red with blood, is a simile like blood. But be that as it may, um, the plagues. Let's talk about the plagues here. The plagues are interesting because the plagues are rather normal in Egypt. The Nile can look red because of some sort of algae, if you will. They can turn the water red, and usually when that happens, it has a proclivity to harm the fish in the Nile. Which, if the fish are called, it sort of disrupts an ecosystem. So if the algae there turning the Nile red like blood, then the fish suffer from it. As a result, they die. And then so on and so forth. You get the frogs, and then you get the disease, and then the gnats, the flies, etc. And then you get the hail. Hail is possible, but I don't think it ravaged the whole. If the text says, which I think it does, it says the whole all Egypt. So if the plagues are like that, it sounds like archaeologically that it didn't ravage or it didn't devastate the country. Now, with the locusts, it's interesting here. One of the plagues of the locusts, because it wiped out their wood. Now, Egypt already didn't really have a lot of wood. It was very sparse in Egypt. So usually what they had to do is import wood from Lebanon, modern day Lebanon, to the northeast. So, but what's interesting, especially with Dr. Cooney's research, well, her thesis, Dr. Cooney, the Egyptologist, in her research, or at least in her thesis, she explored coffin reuse because of a wood shortage, which seems to link it to the plague of locusts. So if you look at it there, and again, the coffin reuse didn't happen until the 20th dynasty, 20th, 21st dynasty of Egypt. So that could be tied to a locust plague, perhaps, if you want to make that sort of connection. But if you're looking for a nationwide devastation and destruction, I don't think you're going to have it. I think the plagues ravaged Egypt, but I don't think it devastated Egypt in the way that he thinks it did.
the Exodus didn't happen, or at least not the way they think it did. So that's what they say. And so some people will say, well, that's okay. We know it happened because it says Ramesses. However, we also know that a lot of the pharaohs, and actually rulers of that time, they were very arrogant. So even when their shortcomings were very evident, they would not tell the world about it. So let's say they lose a battle, they're not putting that on a monument. They will not do that. If you look at all the Egyptian inscriptions and monuments, all the pharaohs are very puffed up.
Yes, and it's called self-aggrandizement. It's not really arrogance. They wanted to portray themselves before the gods as victorious, strong, and mighty. That's what they were doing. It wasn't for themselves. They wanted to show the gods that they were strong. So it wasn't just because they wanted to come off arrogant. I get the self-aggrandizement, but it was to show themselves to the gods that they were strong, steadfast rulers, at least when it comes to the kings. So
We are God. I am son of this and son of that, going down all these generations. And they even sometimes change their genealogies because they're not the firstborn son. They're like born to like a third wife, but they want to make it so they seem like they lied a lot.
not really. So with the Egyptian succession laws, you had to be born of the pharaoh and his great royal wife. If you were a firstborn son, because of that couple, because of the copulation in that couple, if I can say that, then you were next in line. You became the crown prince. If you weren't the great royal wife, if you weren't a direct descendant of the great royal wife, that is, if she didn't produce you, and the king had to select a wife from his harem or harem and then produce a child, that firstborn son then would become king. Now, I understand in the reign of Hatshepsut, she had to attach herself to the goddess Isis, I want to say. I want to say it's Isis, I'm not 100% sure. but she attached herself to, she became God, Amun's wife of Amun. That was it. She attached the title God's wife of Amun. And that's how she assured everyone of her legitimacy to the throne. Now, that happened during Hatshepsut, but most of the kings, if I'm not mistaken, didn't really have to add or prove their legitimacy at all. Now, there were some circumstances in which they did, but that's about it. As far as names, they did have a fivefold titulary, or at least the king had a fivefold titulary, but no one else really had that. And as far as son of, son of, son of, son of, you see this in the biblical text as well, especially with the genealogies in the Old Testament. You have so and so, son of this, son of this, son of this. And this is how they also introduced themselves in the ancient world. I am so and so, son of so and so, from the town of such and such. So this was a rather common gesture or act that they did in the ancient world.
And change things so that they sounded really good. And so Ramesses actually does this during one of the biggest battles he's ever done, the Battle of Kadesh with the Hittite Empire, which is like southern Turkey area, Syria. They came to a battle,
Anatolia, but yeah.
And Ramesses and the Hittites clashed, and it was back and forth for a little bit. But what's funny is no one clearly won. The city was not taken. Both armies went home. The Hittites were still a very powerful army, and so was Egypt. Yet both of them go home and say, we destroyed our enemies. We obliterated them. They were no more, whatever. They have these inscriptions.
And again, that's because he wanted to portray himself in front of the gods as a victorious warrior, not because he was puffed up.
And then there's a peace treaty right next to it, talking about how my brother of the Hattusi, he's my whatever, and they have these trade agreements. And it's like, excuse me, you said you obliterated them. So it's very exaggerated. So some scholars will say it did happen during this time. They just wouldn't record it because it's extremely embarrassing. There's another.
I would actually agree with them. They didn't record it.
Another option, though. When we look at the biblical date in 1 Kings chapter 6.
Oi, again with the biblical date. You could turn that into a drinking song or drinking game.
Verse 1. It's talking about Solomon constructing the temple. Like David wanted to, and God told him no. It's very honorable that you want to, but your son's going to do it. So Solomon starts to build it. Now it came about on the 480th year after the sons of Israel came out of the land of Egypt, he began to build the house of the Lord. So there are a couple dates where then we know the temple was finished and constructed. It took a few years. So I put around 960 BC. Some people say it's 957. Some people say it's 967. So it's give or take some time. But it's right around this time that it's finished.
967.
If we go back 480 years, because that's what the text tells us, since they've been out of Egypt, it's around 1450 BC, which is generally accepted. I think 1446 is the exact date that they say the Exodus should have happened. So this gives us this date. And if you notice, if I go back, 1279, 1213, or at least somewhere in the middle of Ramesses, and 1450 are a couple hundred years off.
Mm-hmm.
So it's not the date that the biblical authors give.
So before he continues here, I wanted to talk about 1 Kings 6:1 for a bit. It might be lengthy, might not. Let's see how fast I can get through this. So 1 Kings 6:1 is a temple text. It's a temple text. It's a temple dedication, not a priest or a temple text. It's a temple dedication. And we see this throughout the ancient Near East as well, where a king will dedicate a temple to a certain god and then say it was 700. There was one in Mesopotamia that said that it had been 720 years since this temple dedication. And there's no way that it was 720 years because the time doesn't add up. This is in Mesopotamia. So what we have here going on in 1 Kings 6:1 is a temple dedication, and the 480 years is the Masoretic text version, and the 440 years is the Septuagint version. So you could very well ask, which one is it? additionally, the problem with taking these numbers literally is that it was these numbers are symbolic, and he probably knows the counter argument, so it's probably nothing new to him, even if he were sitting next to me saying, "Well," but the numbers here are simply symbolic. As far as 480, it's a multiple of 12 or a multiple of 4. So 480 is just a symbolic number for a really, really, really long time, like the 720 for the temple to, I want to say it was Marduk. And then there was a temple dedication for King Seti I. He also, and his length, or at least the numbers in his temple dedication, are also rather lengthy, hundreds of years. And we just simply cannot take these numbers literally as he would like to. Even though you do wind up at a date 1450, 1446.
So why is Ramesses included there? Right? If they say it happened in 1450 BC or around that time, why did the biblical authors write Ramesses? Are they just wrong? Did they date incorrectly? Mm-hmm. And some people would interpret that 480 symbolically, that it's actually made up of 25-year generations, and so then they get it around that.
No, it's not just 25-year generations. That's not our argument. Our argument is that it's symbolic and it's a multiple of 12. Much like the sexagesmal number system in Mesopotamia, the Hebrews or the Jews or the Israelites, however you want to call them, used a different number system. That's all that's going on. The numbers are symbolic. It has nothing to do with generations, 25-year generations.
1,200, I think that's too many hoops to jump through. Instead, it seems more like Ramesses is an anachronism. So basically a name that's not in the right time period. So absolutely as scribes were copying the Pentateuch, they're copying the law. So like each new king, each prince, it's told us in the law that they had to have their own copy, that they would read this, they would day and night meditate on it, and that's what God gave them. When you have kings, this is how you should do it. And so they were going to make new copies of the law. They were going to read it. And as they were copying it, saving it for newer generations, it's very possible that they looked at this and go, hold on, that old city's not there anymore. Like in 1400 BC, it was called something else, and now it's called Ramesses, right? So if we're getting in the time of David and Solomon, it's now Ramesses. It was.
Okay, I think I know what he's saying here. He's saying that they did a name change to the city during Ramesses' reign, and there's simply no archaeological evidence for this. They've already done underground penetration, and there's nothing underneath the current archaeological site of Pi-Ramesses. The city was constructed during Ramesses II's reign, and it was abandoned around 1079 BCE. So there is no archaeological evidence of a destruction layer underneath the one that Ramesses II built. So Ramesses II founded the city of Pi-Ramesses or P-Ramesses, and it was later abandoned in 1079 BCE. There was no, this city was built in the Middle Kingdom. Nah, it didn't happen. So that's what he's talking about here, is that this city was constructed sometime long before Ramesses the Great ever came along, when there simply isn't any evidence of it. You could argue it's an argument from silence, which is what I think it is, especially since there's really no archaeological evidence of P-Ramesses being constructed prior to Ramesses himself, and there was a name change. There's just nothing, there's no evidence for it.
Wasn't beforehand. They just updated the name. It's the same exact location. This is where Goshen was. Ramesses is in the center of it. They just updated the name.
2 kilometers away from...
It's the same place. And I don't see any problem with that at all. We know that Moses would add in little parabolic statements. So he would say they were headed eastward towards this town, and then he put a little, which is near where Sodom and Gomorrah were destroyed. Like it's little additions where he's telling people, almost like this roadmap, hey, when you get here, this is around where it was, because the Israelites needed to understand it. Because future generations wouldn't know where these places are. They're destroyed, they're renamed, new cultures have taken over them. So it's just an update of the city name, which is totally fine. Jerusalem used to just be called Salem, and it was changed. So you see how that's okay. I don't have a problem with that at all. And when you actually go back to the biblical date of 1450 BC, there are a lot of evidence that points to it. So if you haven't watched this documentary, filmmaker Tim Mahoney had this exact question. He asked, okay, well, why is there no evidence? And he was studying the Bible and he realized it's a different date. And he goes, okay, well, what happens if we go back and we do look at the archaeology of around the 1400s, 1500s? What's there? And he found a lot that points to the Israelites being in Egypt, excuse me, at the time the Bible says so.
What does he mean by at the time the Bible says so? One of the things Patterns of Evidence does that he unfortunately omits here is David Roll's part in this, and that he wishes to shrink the timeline down to 300. He wishes to take away or subtract 300 years of ancient history. 300 years. And that's simply not possible. And if you actually watch his videos, by the way, I've also done reaction videos to a number of Tim Mahoney's channel. I've done a number of videos on Tim Mahoney's channel if you wish to go take a look at those. But one thing he omits is the 300 years that David Roll wishes to subtract from the chronology, smushing things together, and you simply cannot do that. What he also admits here, number two, what he also admits is that both they interviewed Dr. James Hoffmeyer and Dr. Brian Wood, and neither one of them, Brian Wood's the early date Exodus proponent. Hoffmeyer isn't. He's a late date Exodus. Brian Wood's, when Tim Mahoney actually asked Brian Wood, Dr. Wood, about subtracting 300 years from the chronology, he thought it was also unnecessary. He thought it was also unnecessary to subtract 300 years from the chronology. So there's even a discrepancy there if you want to look at it for early date Exodus proponents.
And so he would agree that it's probably just an updated name of the city. It's the same city, it's just a new name.
Which is exactly what
we should look underneath that city for the ruins of where the Israelites would have been living. So, underneath Pi Ramesses, that city that they're always saying there's no evidence for the Israelites, there's actually several other layers of ruins underneath it. It used to be called Avaris.
That's just factually incorrect. Avaris was 2 kilometers away from Pi Ramesses. Pi Ramesses was the capital of ancient Egypt, the new kingdom of ancient Egypt, the 19th dynasty. It was the capital of the new kingdom. Avaris was 2 kilometers away. They're 2 different archaeological sites. Avaris does not rest underneath Pi Ramesses. It doesn't. And actually, when Avaris was abandoned, the port was still active well into the late New Kingdom. Possibly past it. I can't remember the dates exactly for the port of Avaris. However, Avaris does not lie underneath Pi Ramesses. It's 2 kilometers away. You have Pi Ramesses, and then you have Kontir. Avaris is Kontir. It's 2 kilometers away. So they're not the same archaeological site, and Avaris does not rest beneath Pi Ramesses. It's just factually incorrect.
And there you find evidence of a people who were from the Levant, so Syria,
Yes.
Palestine, Canaan area.
Yes, you do. There you find evidence of Amorite
their homes,
or Amoritic
their clothing,
Semites,
their
or Semite
hairstyle, their
Amorites.
weapons, their tools are all from this area. They're
From
very,
Avaris,
like,
yes.
if you go to an Egyptian town nearby, totally different. They even were buried with some goats and donkeys, like herd type of lifestyle, which the Egyptians were not. It's very different, and they're all living here. And so that is very important. There were people from the area that Jacob and his family were from. They were living here, and there was a lot of them. So what's really cool, and Tim Mahoney talks about this.
Yes, he does.
Archaeologists, I think it's Manfred Betek is the archaeologist. He finds a small palace structure in the center of this older city. And what's really cool is that it has 12 pillars making up its structure. And there's 12 burial plots that are done in the Syrian style, so this Middle Eastern style. 12 is very, very specific. There were 12 sons, so if those pillars are holding up the family house, that's important. There are 12 burial plots, and one of them in particular is a pyramid. It's a small pyramid, not like the pyramids of Giza, but the fact that this individual was given a period means he's of noble ranking. That's very important for the Egyptians. Not everybody got that. What's even more interesting is that it's not done in the Egyptian fashion. When you look on the inside, there's a sarcophagus. So again, he was given the full burial right. But there's an Asiatic statue. And what I mean by Asiatic, that's the term the Egyptians would give to people who were from the Eastern lands.
Egyptians did do that.
They're not Egyptian, they're
they
Middle
were
Eastern or further
Asiatics.
on. So they gave them very specific details. So the statue had a specific haircut, he had specific clothing, even like the tools, you know how they have their arms crossed? He had a shepherd's
Crook
hook
and flail, that
or
was only for the
a
king.
different tool that he's not Egyptian. The skin color was lighter. So, and even there was a coat he was wearing.
This is all
And
speculation.
it's old and deteriorated, but some of
you cannot look at this thing and walk away thinking it's Joseph. It's sheer speculation to assume that this is Joseph. How do you know that? Did Joseph carve his name into it? Did the Egyptians carve his name into it? The paint's chipped off. The statue's somewhat disfigured because it's been around for so long. It's eroded. Time has taken a toll on it. You cannot simply walk away from this thinking, that's Joseph. That's 100% Joseph. No. No, that's not how we do archaeology.
of the archaeologists even think that it was colored, multicolored.
No, they
All
don't.
of these point to Joseph. He was buried with the other 12, which are all done in the Syrian fashion. He's not buried in the pyramids or other things. He's buried with them in this very Middle Eastern centered home and city. He's given an Egyptian burial, but he wasn't Egyptian. And also what's interesting is his bones are missing. When we go to like the tombs of the kings, all these other very specific tombs of pharaohs, if robbers have found it, if grave robbers have found it, they take all the gold, anything that's worth any sort of money or monetary value. They leave the sarcophagus. We don't want to take, they don't care about the mummies. Why would I take bones? They're not worth anything. Sometimes they would deface them, maybe, but most of that they think happened because
Depends
they were
on
like trying to
who.
take the masks off them. It wasn't on
Depends on who
purpose.
it
I mean,
is.
they were also superstitious. If these are your ancestors, these were supposed to be gods, don't mess with their bodies, but we can take their stuff. They weren't that superstitious.
Not everyone. Again, not everyone. If they were from noble birth, no. Kings, yes. Or unless they had a personal vendetta against a certain noble, maybe. Sometimes they were craftsmen because they earned a lot of money. Sometimes it was a less affordable grave, but they didn't certainly disfigure their faces. More so, that was for rulers or kings because the people who built the tombs, namely in the New Kingdom, so you got Dir el Bahri in the Valley of the Kings, the craftsmen and the people who worked on those tombs, if they didn't like a certain pharaoh, they'd go in because they knew where it was and maybe take some gold. If they didn't like the king, maybe they would um, disfigure their faces on their on their tomb walls. But that would be the only reason. They didn't really go around just, I don't know, disfiguring a face because they were superstitious. It was probably because they didn't like the individual in this life.
So this sarcophagus, it's missing the bones completely, which matches the biblical text. Joseph said on his deathbed to his children, when you leave Egypt, because God has promised that we will return to Canaan and it will be our land, take my bones with you and bury them there. And it says when they leave, Moses takes the bones with him per that request.
Yes.
If it was a grave robber, why would I take this? It's not even in a gigantic tomb. It's just this little tiny baby pyramid. Why would they do that? They wouldn't. They haven't done it in any other tomb. It's done here because Moses did it. This is Joseph. It's also interesting that around the time when we think Joseph should be there, there is let me look for the name of I didn't record it. There is a Pharaoh who constructs. He's given credit for constructing what's known as the Bar Yosuf. That's the waterway of Joseph. That's its name to this day.
Yeah, that's his name to this day. However, the canal that he's talking about that connects the Nile River to the Fayum or Fayum was constructed well before the even early date Exodus took place. and the dates for Joseph hundreds of years before. It existed well into the New Kingdom already. The canal already existed in the Old Kingdom. Joseph, according to early date Exodus proponents, lived during the Middle Kingdom. So he, even by those standards, he did not construct the canal. Now, if he says something like, well, the canal was there already, so he just removed the silt and blah, 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 where's the evidence for it? Because if I'm not mistaken, the canal silted up during the Late Bronze Age after the Late Bronze Age collapse. So, again, this is nothing more than speculation.
Now, it wasn't called that originally,
I mean,
probably
it
because the
could
Pharaoh would
be,
take
but,
credit
you know.
for it, but that is what it's been known for a long time. And if you've ever seen a picture of Egypt, you know, the Nile runs south to north towards the Mediterranean. You have the Nile Delta where a lot of the cities are at. There's an offshoot of the river, and it goes to a lake that's been channelized to make more water go towards that lake and fill it up. So if Joseph knows there's 7 years of plenty, he's going to irrigate and make those fields plentiful. And also, if he knows a drought and a famine's coming, best place is to make a reservoir of water so we continue to grow crops and feed our cattle and everything else. And it's called Bar Yusuf. So colloquially, everyone thinks that's Joseph's. This is how he saved Egypt.
But that doesn't mean that it was Joseph in the past. It's probably just based off of superstition. They've read the text, they know about Joseph. They called it Bar Yosef. Like, how do you know that's the Joseph from Exodus, or from late Genesis, from Genesis 37 to Genesis 49 and early into Exodus? How do you know that that's Joseph? Because the text doesn't say he built a canal. Again, this is sheer speculation. Sheer speculation. And they just run with it.
Around the time when he's supposed to be there. This is awesome. Joseph was in Egypt, and he did exactly what he was supposed to do. He was second in command, so he's given a pyramid.
They basically see what
and
they
he is
want
buried
to
in an
see.
Egyptian fashion with people who were from the Middle East, with 12 pillars. This is Jacob's family, and there's evidence of them being there. The text also tells us a new Pharaoh comes after Joseph has died, and he doesn't know Joseph, he doesn't know those people, and he enslaves them.
Now, this is interesting. I really think this is interesting because, well, you know what? I'll save my thoughts here until I'll let him speak, and then I'll speak.
The question
after.
is, who is this new Pharaoh? Because Exodus doesn't give us any names of who the pharaohs are. Later texts will tell us about Pharaoh Shishak and so were around the time of kings. Here, though, it seems that Moses was following the general writing of the time, and he was educated in the Egyptian way.
Yes.
When there was correspondence or texts written, not inscriptions, because they would want fancy names written on walls, but they would just write Pharaoh. It was seen as a big title. So it seems that Moses may have done this because that's how he was used to writing it. Some people will say there's a theological.
Okay, the term Pharaoh didn't come about, I think I mentioned this in one of my shorts recently, the term Pharaoh did not come about until the reign of Thutmose III. That's when the term Pharaoh, before that was just king. So by the time we get to Moses, they were already calling Pharaoh king, or King Pharaoh, excuse me. They were calling the king Pharaoh. Pharaoh was also synonymous with the government, much like how we say White House. Oh, the White House said this, or the White House said this when we actually mean the president. So Pharaoh was also meant as, well, the palace said this, well, Pharaoh said this. So
Issue. They didn't want to say the name of the Pharaoh, but later texts do it, so it's probably not the case. It's more so this is just how he was taught to write.
yeah, because of change in politics.
And it seems like there are.
So what is interesting here, since I think he's finished here, is that, so what happened at the end of the Middle Kingdom? You had the fall of the Middle Kingdom. Sobek-Neferu was the last ruler of the Middle Kingdom, happens to be a woman, but she was the last ruler. And Avaris was founded about this time. Avaris was founded roughly around the Middle Kingdom, late Middle Kingdom. And during this time, you had a flood of Amorite Semitics, or Semitic Amorites. These Amorites would flood into Avaris. This city became to be as big as 50,000 people living in Avaris. And it was full of Semitic population. You had a temple. We've discovered a temple of Seth, alongside the temple of Baal. So you had Egyptians living with these Amorites at the same time. But when the Middle Kingdom fell, more Amorites came, and then they sort of overthrew the Egyptians, pushed the Egyptians out of Lower Egypt. So Egypt proper became Upper Egypt because of the capital of Thebes. And then beginning in the 17th dynasty of Egypt, you had a pharaoh called, or a king called Seqen-Enre. And he started retaking or attempting to retake Lower Egypt. He actually died, at least we think he died in battle because he has head trauma or a head wound, possibly by a mace. And then Ahmose took over, and he actually drove the Hyksos out of Lower Egypt, establishing the 18th dynasty. Now, this could be the Pharaoh, at least I think it is, could be the Pharaoh that did not recognize Joseph, because Joseph was an Amorite, Ahmose was not, he was Egyptian. So, before this as well, this probably allowed Joseph to become vizier when the Hyksos were ruling Lower Egypt. They had been thoroughly Egyptianized. They were worshiping the same gods as some of them were. You had a temple of Seth and a temple of Baal in the same city. So it's possible that the Hyksos were worshiping, or at least adopted, some of the Egyptian gods. Seth and Baal were similar anyway because they were storm gods. Seth was a desert storm god, and Baal was a storm god as well. You had Baal, hey dad, blah blah blah. So it's rather plausible, and I use the term plausible here rather than certainty because this is how we do history and archaeology. It's rather plausible that Joseph rose to the position of vizier during the Hyksos rule of Lower Egypt, which would make sense because no Egyptian would allow an Amorite to become vizier, especially in the 18th and 19th dynasties.
Several pharaohs over this time period, right? Because Joseph and Moses were not around during the same time. So they just give it Pharaoh. And so for a brief time, the population of these foreigners, these Palestinian individuals, it grows in Avaris. There are so many settlements around and in Goshen of these Syrian individuals that their population is just booming, which is what the text states. Probably, just like Jacob's family was coming to Egypt, you had more families migrating from that area because there's a famine. It says that everyone was coming to Egypt because they had food. So you have foreigners coming from the nearest areas, right? Canaan, they're settling there. So there's a time in Egypt's history where it's called the Hyksos. They take over Egypt and they are considered to be Asiatic foreigners. This is around like 1650 BC, 1600s. So this is a couple hundred years. 17th century. It's after Joseph, before Moses. They actually take over. They put a pharaoh in power. It's not Egyptians. And the Egyptians are actually forced to the south of Egypt. And they are no longer ruling the nation, but these foreigners are. And guess where they make their capital? Avaris, which is where Jacob and his family settled. This is a huge trade city at this time. More than likely, yes. There's even almost like a citadel built there. It's a very big capital for them, and they're trying to make their rule found it and keep it. It doesn't last. They're only there for about 100 years. But what's interesting, if this is true, and this is the Pharaoh that we think came afterwards, the Egyptians were in debt to Joseph and his family. They gave them the best place of the land where they could herd and they could grow crops and they could live, and it was fine. If those people are forced out by other individuals from Canaan, they would be afraid, if they're trying to instate their rule, that these other friends of Egyptians, Jacob's family, would rise up with the Egyptians we just forced out and attack us. Who would be their enemies? If it was just Egyptians the entire way through, who would they be afraid of? They have the most powerful rule at the time. No one. It was an internal threat. They were afraid that Jacob and the Israelites would rise up with the old Egyptian pharaohs that were kicked out and push the Hyksos away.
No.
The Egyptians do it by themselves. They show up from the south through Kamose and Amos, those are the two pharaohs, and they push the Hyksos out. And it seems like they continued the oppression of the Israelites. They didn't know Joseph either. For 100 years, they have been pushed out of their home.
Again, I cannot stress this enough. There were no Israelites at the time. These were Amorites. who later became what we know the Israelites centuries later.
By people who look just like the Israelites. They probably just continued the
because
slave
they would have
labor.
labeled them as
They have to
Asiatics.
rebuild their nation. And so they push
At
the
least
Hyksos
Lower
out
Egypt.
completely, and they continue the oppression of the Israelites. So the new Pharaoh was actually not Egyptian originally. And so there's kind of a couple changes of power here. And I think it fits really, really well.
I'm sorry? What do you mean, new Pharaoh? First of all, it was a king, because we're not at Thutmose III yet. Secondly, there's a change in dynasty here. You had the 17th dynasty that was replaced by the 18th dynasty, specifically Thutmose. He was the first pharaoh of the 18th dynasty. This was roughly around 1550 BCE. As you pointed out, Joshua, wow, I'm addressing him personally now. You pointed out that the city of Avaris was founded by these, possibly founded by these, I think they were founded by these Amorites. Avaris was founded by Amorites, and then more Amorites came flooding in. As you said, this was probably around 1650. As you said, I have no quibble or problem with the 1650 date, but the 18th dynasty, it was probably earlier than 1650, but I'll leave that as it may. Thutmose came and drove them out around 1550 BCE. The 18th dynasty came around 1550 BCE, so that would put Joseph before that. So he was probably early 16th century at the latest, or 17th century was Joseph during the Hyksos rule. And so when he died, subsequent or following rulers of the Hyksos knew Joseph, but by the time Thutmose, because of a dynasty shift in Egypt, when the Egyptians drove the Hyksos out, there was a dynasty shift. Thutmose assumed the throne thanks to Seqen-Enre, and Thutmose, who drove the Hyksos out of Egypt, establishing the 18th dynasty. This is the 18th dynasty that did not know Joseph, nor his works, nor his family. That's our argument. And furthermore, I should like to add here that the Egyptians looked at Lower Egypt at this time and thought of them as foreigners. They were conquering a foreign land. So when they took over Lower Egypt, they took the prisoners of war and they became the enslaved peoples. And there was probably several ethnic groups at that time there who became the enslaved peoples of Egypt. And then you fast forward to the 19th dynasty, namely Ramesses II, and Ramesses II forces these Amorites to construct these two storage cities, Per Itum and then Per Ramses, or P. Ramesses and Pithom. So that's our argument. And it's not really talking about one specific pharaoh or king, as some people seem to allege. It's talking about several different kings throughout, or at least 2 or 3 or 4 kings throughout the 18th and 19th dynasty. And finally, I should also like to add, as Joshua here mentioned, that Moses was raised, or he was educated in the Egyptian way, being that he was more or less Egyptianized. He was educated through Egypt. Exodus. Now, Dr. James Hoffmeyer has suggested that Exodus 2, in which we see this on display, describes what was called a nursery in Egypt that seems to fit perfectly in the 19th dynasty, where they would adopt foreigners. Egyptians used to adopt foreigners, Egyptianize them, teach them, and raise them in the Egyptian ways and customs. You had this specifically in the 19th dynasty.
Well, because Egyptian pharaohs would know who the Israelites were. They saved Egypt. These newcomers don't. These foreigners continue to grow. They get
That's because the newcomers were the 18th dynasty.
pushed out. Then the Exodus is going to happen sometime after that, when the Egyptian pharaohs take power again. And
the 18th dynasty.
What's interesting is that there's evidence of plagues in writing. It's not on inscriptions. I still think the statement where the people are thinking it's Ramesses, I don't think it's during Ramesses, but their point about pharaohs not writing their shortcomings is true. They never would. We have evidence and proof that they would fail and lose terrible battles, and they were rebelled against. None of that's recorded. No one would record that unless they lost and the new pharaoh told everybody about the old pharaoh. So there's no doubt in my mind of why it's not recorded on the side of a pyramid somewhere. Instead, it's written by a guy named Ipuwer, the Admonitions of Ipuwer. And he writes, this is around the time of the Exodus, 1450 BC. They give it a large date, but this fits in the timeline really well. He talks about how all the water is turning to blood, that people were trying to dig around the Nile, not in the Nile itself, but trying to get to the water table, and it was still blood, that their cows and their cattle were dying. There was hail and fire from the sky, that slaves were taking their owner's property and leaving. All of this is perfect. This is exactly what the Exodus states. And if you watch that documentary, Tim Mahoney actually asks some of the archaeologists about this parchment, and they are like, no, this can't be the Exodus. And he asks why. He goes, well, the Exodus happened during the time of Ramesses.
More or less straw manning. This is a straw man fallacy. So the Admonitions of Ipuwer, the earliest text that we have, or the latest text that we have, dates to the New Kingdom. But the text itself is older. We think the Admonitions of Ipuwer were actually written during the Middle Kingdom of Egypt. Additionally, the Admonitions of Ipuwer is a sociological and political document detailing that Egypt is in a state of stress. It's in dire straits, in other words, and that things are not normal. Everything's topsy-turvy. That's what the Admonitions of Ipuwer are about. It's sociological and politically. It's a sociological and political treatise, if you will, written during the Middle Kingdom, not during the New Kingdom. We just happen to have the latest document, the latest text of it, and that text itself, the parchment or whatever, dates to the New Kingdom. But the Admonitions of Ipuwer is actually older than that. So he's just trying to shoehorn this to fit a 1450, 1446 date.
This should readjust your thinking and go, hold on, there's plentiful evidence here. Maybe we are wrong with our dates, so we need to go back. Someone is recording right here and now that the Exodus happened. Pharaoh wouldn't do it. He's too proud to even let the Israelites go. His viziers, his right-hand men actually said, what's wrong with you? Like the text tells us, don't you see that Egypt is destroyed? It was probably one of those same people who wrote this. Pharaoh wouldn't do it.
No, it wasn't.
But his scribes would. They have lost faith in their Pharaoh. And so they wrote it down. So, I mean, I can't be dogmatic about this, but this seems really, really good for the Exodus story. But the question still remains is, who is Pharaoh? It seems like there's a whole lot of evidence of Joseph and Jacob living there.
This I actually find interesting that he actually doesn't choose Thutmose or Amenhotep II. Instead, he chooses Thutmose III. And this is actually, it fits better Thutmose III with the current chronology used. Because Thutmose reigned from the Thutmoses or Thutmose III, whichever, if you want to use the Greek or Egyptian, it doesn't matter. He actually reigned from 1479 to 1425. He was Pharaoh, and by the way, again, as I've mentioned before in this video, this is when the term Pharaoh started to be used in the way that we understand it, was during his reign. So, it's interesting because Amenhotep II wasn't ruling Egypt in 1446. So,
being enslaved and for the reason for it, and then the Exodus happening. But why, like, who is this Pharaoh since the text doesn't give it to us? I'm guessing, and there's a lot. There's a lot of theories. If you ever studied this at all, there are a ton of people who are pointing at different pharaohs over time because the Egyptians had a bad habit of, if there was a new line of pharaohs, they would go find the old inscriptions and deface them. If I didn't like my stepmom because there was a lot of...
No, that's just factually incorrect. That happened with Hatshepsut and Thutmose III. That's one of the more famous ones. But they didn't just go back to previous kings in Egypt and then deface their statuary. They didn't do that all the time. They didn't just go back and choose, oh, I hate the 11th dynasty of Egypt. I'm going to go back and destroy and disfigure all the statuary of Mentuhotep II. They didn't do that. Now, I think what you mean to say, Joshua, is that they defaced Hatshepsut. They defaced her statuary. It's evident in her Temple of Millions of Years that Thutmose III defaced her statuary and chiseled out her face on the temple walls. So we do have evidence of that. But as far as going back and defacing certain pharaohs hundreds of years later, that didn't really happen. We don't really have evidence of that. Certain pharaohs or certain kings, yes, we do have evidence of that, but not they just didn't go back to certain dynasties and just decide, I guess we don't like this pharaoh or king. We don't like this king, so we'll just deface his statuary and chisel out his face. No, that's not how that works.
In breeding, if I didn't like what she did or what he did to me or how they ruled and no one liked them, I didn't want to be associated with them, I would just delete their monuments and their inscriptions out of history. Because they also believe that if I do that, their spirit is no longer in the afterlife. They were really petty. That's what they would.
No, it's not petty. They wanted, when you chisel someone's face out, let's deal with Hatshepsut. You chisel their face out, or you deface their statuary, particularly a Ka statue of some kind. If you disfigure that in any way, their spirit, when it comes back to feast, when it comes back to eat in this realm, it needs to recognize itself. If you disfigure their face, or their faces, their spirit will not recognize that and then starve. It's a little more than pettiness. And it reveals how little you know of Egyptian religion. It wasn't petty. It was... It's almost akin to virtually to murder in the afterlife. If you disfigure their statuary and faces on their temple walls, their spirit wouldn't recognize them and starve because they couldn't eat because they didn't recognize their own bodies. The Akh, they wouldn't recognize the Akh, their body.
Do to ensure their power and to make everyone think they were great. So it's difficult when we try to date things. I think it was Thutmose, or Thutmosis is sometimes how it's said, the third.
I already decided to.
His reign is right in the middle. The Exodus is right in the middle of that. And what's interesting is that his firstborn son, Amun-her-khepeshef, he dies early. There's no reason, doesn't state why. He's given a very high title. He's over all of the cattle, especially for religious sacrifice and things. It just says he dies early. He was the heir, but he perishes. And so his next son takes the throne after him. But it's really interesting that this is the case. Also, another detail is that his son, which let me see if I can get his name, Amenhotep II is his name. Hatshepsut. Have you ever heard of Hatshepsut? She was one of the greatest pharaohs.
Okay, I'm gonna stop here. Before he delves into Hatshepsut. What is interesting here is that there are several pharaohs or several kings. Cross-mojoing my kings and pharaohs here, whether they come before. I'm trying to keep them the kings before Thutmose III and their pharaohs after. But anyway, be that as it may. There are several pharaohs or kings in the 18th and 19th dynasties whose firstborn sons did not make it. Thutmose III is not the only one. Amenhotep II had one. Ramesses II also had a firstborn son that died around 25 years of age. Amun-her-khepeshef. I'm butchering his name. When I have it written down, it's easy to pronounce, but please forgive me, Egyptologists, when you hear this, but it's Amun-her-khepeshef. I'll find the name and put it in the description below. Anyway.
That was a woman. Many times a woman didn't rule, but when Thutmose III dies, the next son to rule, which is Amenhotep, he's too young. So Hatshepsut, his wife, takes over. So she's like a co-regent with the son. He's still Pharaoh, but she's got the power for the time being until he's old enough, and that's how they rule. What's interesting is that she could have been the stepmom who adopts, like the daughter of the previous Pharaoh to adopt Moses. And I'll give more evidence for that later. So the problems, though, with choosing this is, again, like with Ramesses, Thutmose was the greatest Egyptian pharaoh ever, even more so than Ramesses.
I would agree.
His
with that.
empire
Thutmose
was
the
from
better,
all of
greater
Egypt
pharaoh.
and Nubia,
Yeah.
all the way across Mesopotamia. He expanded it as much as he could.
Mm-hmm.
He was the greatest pharaoh ever. And another problem is that he lived past when the Red Sea crossing is supposed to happen, and a lot of believers will state the Pharaoh died in the Red Sea. So people say, well, it can't be him because he's still living. We need to find someone who abruptly dies. So as I stated before, they don't talk about their shortcomings, so it's no doubt to me why he wouldn't.
He may talk about this in a minute, but if I'm not mistaken, he's actually quoting Psalms, specifically maybe Psalm 136 that says Pharaoh died in the Red Sea. There's a problem when you take the Psalms or the Proverbs literally because they're poetry. You can't really take them literally. So, because Psalm 136 says Pharaoh died in the Red Sea, Exodus actually does not say that. So, it's really problematic if you try to interpret the Psalms literally, and I think I established that on another video of mine. So,
record this, they wouldn't say anything that's negative, and they would puff up all of their victories.
Again, to look great.
Wouldn't want to remember the Exodus. However, the fact that Egypt is the most prosperous here when God decides to attack does not surprise me. He said that he wanted all of Egypt in the world to know that he was Yahweh, he was God, and not Pharaoh and the Egyptian deities. Why? Because all of the known world was conquered by Thutmose III. Everyone across Mesopotamia would know about this
Not really the
if
known
Egypt
world,
was
but
defeated
that's...
by God. And what happens when Joshua and the Israelites come into Canaan? Rahab tells them, we know what your God did to Egypt. Because at this time, Egypt controlled all of it, and they would have heard of it. So I think this is the perfect time for God to strike, when Egypt is at its height. And he knows this. So remember, his first son dies. He is the strongest. What about him dying in the Red Sea? I don't think that that's a necessary statement, that the Pharaoh had to have died in the Red Sea. In the Exodus story, it doesn't say that he does. It says that Pharaoh's army was destroyed in the drowning when the Red Sea comes across. The 600 chariots and the foot soldiers that go into after them, they're drowned. And they all die. However, it does not mention that Pharaoh himself dies. In one of the Psalms, Psalm 136, it mentions shaking off Pharaoh and his army in the Red Sea. So some people will say, well, because of that, he had to have died in it. Again, I don't think so, because the word shaking off means like lifting a weight, like an oppression. So basically, with the Red Sea crossing, Egypt had no power over Israel anymore. God had done away with that. By thrusting them into the Red Sea and the Exodus, they are no longer your problem. He shook them off of their garments, is the way it's described.
100%.
Also, Psalms is very poetic, and it's talking about David, probably David has written this. It's not, I don't think it's as fact as the historical kind of Exodus, which doesn't record. You'd think that if that happened, they would want to say, Pharaoh died. Like, that would be a pretty big point. Instead, they still reference Egypt, saying we need to go back to where Pharaoh fed us, which is ridiculous, but they do say that. So I don't think it's necessary that he dies in it. I think it was just necessary to show he's nothing. That's what God wanted. He is nothing. And it's probably even bigger embarrassment to obliterate your army and let you sit in that. And the fact that your nation is
embarrassment for Egypt,
plagued
which is why they
and destroyed.
I've got no problem with that.
So I don't think it's absolutely necessary for him to die. So looking at the next son, so Amenhotep II, what's interesting about him, so this is going to give evidence backwards because I think it's Thutmose III. So he feels it necessary during his reign to deface the monuments of his co-regent and stepmother Hatshepsut.
Mm-hmm.
Why? Why does he do that?
We're not really sure.
Well, some people say, well, it's because she's a female. Well, there were other
Some
female
say
pharaohs
that is one
didn't happen.
explanation.
She was very powerful. She did good things. What's wrong with that? Is it possible that he did not really care for her because she's the one who adopted Moses? And that's looked down on their...
No, that is not it. We have no evidence that Hatshepsut adopted some figure called Moshe or Moses. We just don't. And again, as I laid out earlier in this video, the Egyptians had something called a nursery in which they would take foreigners and bring them into their palace and Egyptianize them, educate them the Egyptian way, teach them to read and write, possibly learn Akkadian because that was the lingua franca of the time. They did that, and it's specifically to the new king, or to the new 19th dynasty. It's specifically exclusive to the 19th dynasty is what I'm trying to say. You didn't really have this in the 18th dynasty. You had this specifically in the 19th dynasty, where they would take these foreigners and then bring them into the palace and educate them, teach them to read and write, teach them hieroglyphics, hieratic, and possibly Akkadian because it's the lingua franca of the day. That's exclusively the 19th dynasty. So we actually do not know why, though. But to back up here, we actually don't know why. One, we don't know why Thutmose III defaced his stepmother's statuary and chiseled out her faces on the temple walls, and secondly, we have no evidence that Hatshepsut adopted Moses. We don't even have anything extra biblically for the existence of Moses. That doesn't mean he doesn't exist, but we just don't have anything, so we can't really create an argument for the existence of Moses outside of the Old Testament. And again, I just have to reiterate here, there's just no evidence that Hatshepsut adopted Moses. It seems more likely that they just took foreigners and brought them into the palace and educated them and Egyptianized them.
Family, because that's what she did and caused all this problem. If she hadn't adopted Moses, none of this would have happened. So he is cutting her name out of everything because she caused these problems. I think it's very possible. Amenhotep II also led campaigns into Canaan. And what's really, really interesting is it happens less than a year after the date of the Exodus. He takes a different army up into Canaan, and he starts attacking certain areas that his father already controls, mind you. These are raids. And he takes in the recorded, he writes down all his booty, right? He takes all this stuff. I'm taking this gold and this, and what he records is up to 100,000 slaves.
He said booty.
Other campaigns don't do this sort of vast slave grab. Why? Well, is it possible that 2 million slaves just left your nation and you need slave labor back because your nation is falling apart?
I want to say, I have to say this, it wasn't 2 million people. It wasn't 2 million people. Actually, I had a comment earlier this week about the 2 million people thing. And it centers around the word Eleph. The Hebrew word Eleph has a couple of definitions. One of them is 1,000, but the other one is a unit. And if you translate it as unit, the numbers drastically shrink. Kenneth Kitchen, in his book, The Reliability of the Old Testament, seems to suggest, along with a couple of others, that the number of people leaving Egypt was around 20,000. The numbers vary from 20,000 up to 50, but on the whole, it wasn't 2 million, and it was significantly smaller than 2 million.
It's very possible. Also, if your father had just set up the Egypt's largest empire and reign ever, why are you just attacking right out of your border? Why are you not expanding the border further and further? This wasn't to put down a rebellion, like in his borders. He needed stuff. He records taking...
He didn't. He wanted to create a buffer state between the Hittite Empire and Egypt. By expanding into the Levant, Egypt created a buffer zone between the Hittite Empire and Egypt proper. Now, he established garrison towns to make some sort of Egyptian presence known in the area, and they exacted some tribute. But ultimately, the reason why Thutmose III did this was because he wanted to create a buffer zone between the Hittite Empire, the Neo-Hittite Empire, by the way, the new kingdom of the Hittite Empire, and the new kingdom in Egypt. That's ultimately the reason why Thutmose III created that buffer zone, or went up into the Levant.
I think it's like over 10,000 weapons, over 1,100 chariots. Like, he's very specific of the stuff he takes and writes
I'm sure
down.
he did,
Probably
yeah.
because he just lost his star army
'Cause
in
it
the
was
Red Sea, and
ridiculous.
he needs to replenish his slave labor, his weapons, and the chariots he just lost.
No.
And he can't expend his borders because he doesn't have that army anymore. He needs to replenish it so that he can.
He probably
He's also
just
making
wanted a
sort of like a
bigger
power
army.
grab, telling the surrounding nations, "I'm still strong." Well, if you were, you would attack them. You wouldn't stay within your own territory. So this is all. You see how he wouldn't record, my nation is destroyed and I lost my army, but he did in a way. He tried to do it and puff himself up. Oh, look at all the chariots and stuff I took. Why do you need that at this time, 6 months after the Exodus happened? It was a very odd time for him to do this. He also,
not, really. Not if you want to create a buffer.
instead of attacking the nations that his father was at war with and was beating, he makes peace treaties with them very suddenly. Sounds like he doesn't have the strength to keep pushing forward. He's dealing with internal troubles that he won't tell us about, even though he kind of does. You see how he's pointing to the fact that his nation is not as good as it was during his father's reign. He doesn't tell you why, but I think we know the Exodus happened right before he took the throne. Absolutely. So then we're going to look just after this. There is the possible mention of Hebrews. So they're not Israel yet. I mean, they are, as the text is concerned, right? They're under Jacob's name, Israel, but they're not a nation yet. They don't have a land that's theirs. In the Amarna letter, so this is going to be towards the end of Amenhotep's reign and a couple other pharaohs. They move their capital to a place called Amarna, and there are all these correspondences. So you can see a picture of it here. They had clay, and they would do it on a.
I'm sorry, what? Armana, Tel El Armana, which was Akhenaten, was the capital for Akhenaten, the heretical king of Egypt in the 18th dynasty. The capital was briefly moved from Thebes to Tel El Armana, the modern day town, but the ancient site of Akhenaten, that Akhenaten, Amenhotep IV, moved his capital there, and the Aten rose to prominence. Not Thutmose III. The Armana letters, they're called the Armana letters because that's where they were discovered. And the Armana letters are correspondence between Egypt and some Babylonian kings, written all in Akkadian, or at least with the powers at the time. So you had the Assyrian Empire, the Hittite Empire, the Egyptians, and the Babylonian Empire. And these are correspondences between them and several Canaanite city-states in the area, squabbling Canaanite city-states. So most of the letters are, come, we seek help from you. It was sometimes the rulers, the big powers that be, Egypt, the Hittite Empire, Assyrian, Babylon, were calling each other brothers. The smaller Canaanite city-states would say Lord when addressing a higher, like the greater powers. So the letters correspond between those greater powers and these squabbling Canaanite city-states. So that's what the Armana letters detail, generally speaking.
On a clay tablet, they would write all these triangular. This is a letter that was written between one of their vassal states in Canaan. It's like Syria, Canaan area. And they would write back to the Pharaoh or to the generals in Egypt and say, hey, this is what's going on.
Namely the king.
And so what's interesting is that some of them mention a group known as the Hapiru or Apiru.
Yes.
And that they are destroying cities. They are taking over land. Our armies are doing nothing against them. We need help. You are supposed to be our sovereign. You're supposed to be Egypt, the god, and you're supposed to protect us. That's why we're in a vassal treaty, that we will pay you tribute and give our soldiers to your army. But in return, you protect us. You control this land. It's still ours, but we have a good relationship here. It doesn't come. No help comes.
Which Amarna
They just
letter says
repeatedly
that?
state another
Which
city has
Amarna letter
fallen.
says that?
Hatzor, the king of Hatzor, which is the king of Canaan, which is a city that Joshua burns to the ground. He writes one and says, I need help. I can't control this
Jabin,
for
but
very
that's
long.
fine.
And
It's a
then
different
another one
Jabin.
from a different city says, he's given over to the Hapiru. So it could be, they're trying to say it was almost like a treaty, or at least he's gone in cahoots with them. But it seems like the Hapiru, whoever they wore him down to the point where he surrenders. It's destroyed. I mean, Joshua records, we just destroyed the city altogether. So, yes. So, some scholars will say, no, this isn't the Hebrews. However, what's interesting is that when Amenhotep and other pharaohs go into Canaan and they take slaves or talk about soldiers they defeated, they mention the Hapiru as its own ethnic group.
That's just factually incorrect. The Hapiru were a social group. They were outcasts. They were outcasts. They weren't an ethnic group. That's why they were probably petitioning the Egyptian king, because these outcasts were threatening their cities or their livelihood or whatever.
Along with other people.
And additionally, before he continues here, it's not mentioned in every Amarna letter. It's not mentioned in every Amarna letter at all. It's mentioned in certain Amarna letter. I can never say this because of my accent, but Amarna letters. Now I'm thinking about it, I'm screwing it up. But it's not in every letter that the Hapiru are mentioned. But we do know it's not an ethnic group. It's a social group of outcasts. Now, if you want to argue and say the Hebrews were a social outcast, that's fine. But then you're going to run into other sorts of problems with that line of reasoning.
People they've destroyed. He actually takes 3,600 Hapiru with him. And so they'll ask the question, well, it doesn't say that in the text that an Egyptian pharaoh came. There's a lot of gray area in the Judges area, and even during the wilderness, Moses writes that God led us through many trials and things. Like there's a time period where maybe some of the Hebrews or the other ethnic groups, because it says they were a mixed multitude when they left Egypt, right? It wasn't just Israelites. Some of the Egyptians realized our gods are not gods and we're going to follow you. It's possible that they included them and that some of these groups kind of shot off of Israel and left. I mean, we know plenty of the Israelites rebelled and God dealt with them in the Israelite group. So it's more than possible that as they came into Canaan to take more slaves, they found some. But regardless, the point is, they viewed this Hapiru as its own group. These are a people group, not just bands of mercenary raiders attacking things. This is a group that's so large they're burning the capital city of Canaan. This is important. So I think this is the Hebrews. They show up and they're mopping up the land with Joshua. It's very interesting. So then let's look at a city they attacked, Jericho. So
I'm not really going to go too much into Jericho. I don't know how much he goes into it. I don't think it's much. But since I've done 2 videos on Jericho, I've done 2 videos on Jericho. I'm not going to touch too much on Jericho. I'll just let him speak here.
There was a group, you see Kenyon in that name. Kathleen Kenyon is an archaeologist, and she, in the 40s, 50s, she was excavating Jericho. Mm-hmm. There were people before her by a last name of Garstang. He said, yes, it's around 1400 BC. This was destroyed by Joshua. Mm-hmm. Kathleen comes in and says, no. If it was around this time, there should be certain types of pottery that we'd find. We don't find that. She's wrong. It was found, and when I looked through the research on this article, I have the URL down here. It's by Brian G. Wood, and I don't know if he's an Egyptologist, but he writes a lot on Egypt and archaeology.
Egyptologist.
If you look back at Garstang's,
I forget what his doctorate is.
Findings, he did find that pottery. She also looked in 2 squares of the city. We've done further excavations and things and found that
I will say Jericho's very muddled. It's very confusing because of poor excavation practices, for one. There are other reasons why. So John Garstang dated the site. I'm sorry, I couldn't contain myself. John Garstang dated the site to 1450. And then Kenyon comes along 20 years later in the 1950s and says, no, we should date this to 1550 because of this destruction layer. She also noted a grave site. She noticed a grave but no city. Until as I mentioned in one of my 2 videos that I'll show somewhere, um, Lorenzo Nigro discovers a destruction layer there in 2019 that dates to the late Bronze Age. So there was a cemetery that Kenyon discovered that she dated to the late Bronze Age, and then Lorenzo Nigro in 2019 says or discovered a destruction layer that seems to match that cemetery, that graveyard in the late Bronze Age. So Kenyon really wasn't wrong because she found a destruction layer in 1550. The problem is that Wood wants to redate the pottery to later so that he can then move the city destruction from 1550 to 1450 BCE. It all surrounds the pottery, and no one is really accepting his conclusions. At least they haven't accepted his conclusions for the better part of 35 years. He still continues to push it to this day on websites like Associates for Biblical Research. I think he was even trying to push it in Patterns of Evidence. But simply put, no one is buying his dating of the pottery.
Even if it wasn't there, that doesn't mean that city's not from that time period, because it's a military outpost and it's a really small city. They're not like on a trade route where you'd expect all of these cultural things to be found. 2, it was found. It's Jericho, and it was destroyed around 1400 BC. But I'm using this graph, or this drawing. This is from her findings. Bryant G. Wood he is using this as well. So I got it from his article that's from her findings. This is the embankment of Jericho. So you see the black stone retention wall here? You had an intermediate embankment, but you had a wall here, and you had a taller wall on top of this up here. So it was a double-walled city. This was very intimidating for other armies. So Israel is walking around this double-walled, impenetrable city. And then the walls fall after 7 days. A lot of archaeologists have suggested it was an earthquake, because it is a tectonically active area that did this. But what's interesting is that if you see this pile down here, both the bricks here and here from an earthquake rolled down the hill and made a perfect ramp up into the city. And the biblical text says that Israel went up and into Jericho, not through a gate.
Yes,
it says they went up and into Jericho.
And yes, there
I think
was
it's
an
very
earthquake.
interesting. You have a perfect ramp. They can just walk right up into the city and burn it.
Later became the Israelites, or at least the Israelites at this time.
So, Kathleen was wrong about the dating.
No, she wasn't.
But what's interesting also, what she found, though, not only were the walls destroyed, but it was set on fire.
Yes, because
which is what
sometimes that
Joshua
happens after
states.
An earthquake.
Wasn't the earthquake that set it on fire? Because there was several, it's a thick layer of ash on top of everything. It was burned completely. But also under the ash and under the flames, there are these huge jars and storage of grain, which is very odd. It means the siege didn't last very long, and it happened just after harvest. That's what the biblical text says. Because normally sieges would last months, years even sometimes, to wear down those people until they had no food and they would surrender, or they would be too weak to defend and they'd attack. This is how a siege would happen. Also, the fact that the grain was left. If you besieged a city, and your army needs food, needs water. When you take the city over, you're going to take all their goods. I mean, that's what Nebuchadnezzar does. In the text, he takes everything that Israel and Jerusalem has. Like, this is what they would do. I need to feed my machine, so I'm going to take all of your stuff after I have destroyed it. This group doesn't. They burn the city and they leave everything in it, which is what God tells the Israelites to do. Take nothing, burn it. And that's what they do. So this fits Joshua's conquest to a T. And so,
say it does, but
I don't know. It blows my mind that we could find this and it fits exactly the way they did it. It's so good. And I don't have a slide up on here, but if you look at the other cities around there, like Ai and Hatzor, they're all destroyed in a similar manner at around the same time.
Even in Hebrew
Kathleen would say it was the Hyksos that were kicked out from Egypt, or it was the Egyptians. Well, we know the Egyptians didn't go that far north because Amenhotep couldn't. We also know the Hyksos, if they were going to occupy this area, they wouldn't burn the cities. They were just kicked out of their home. And it didn't make any sense. She didn't want it to be the biblical Israelites. But it fits really well that it's all destroyed around the same time, destroyed in the manner that the Israelites were told to. and it's at the right date. And the hapiru are the ones doing it, which is the Egyptian word for Israel or Hebrew Israelites. It's really, really cool. Now that term hapiru, if you read on it, later they just use it for anyone they don't like. But at that time, it was very ethnically centered. This is who they are. But later there's like the hapiru have attacked us. But
Because
for the time being.
It's a social group.
So why does this matter? So we know that God's word is true. So that does not.
All right, guys. I'm going to stop here since he's at his conclusion. And that will conclude this installment. If you guys like this, I encourage you guys to go ahead and hit that like button. And if you haven't yet, please hit that subscribe button in order to receive future notifications. And as always, I should like to encourage you guys as well to leave your thoughts in the comments below. And I will see you guys next time.